Hi, and in this video we're going to have a look at why fear, what's the purpose of it. So I know most people know that fear's there in order to protect us. It's a protection mechanism, and in short, it's there to stop us getting eaten and to become somebody else's lunch. But fear wasn't always there, and it's largely been an evolutionary process. Now I'm just going to take you through the story of that evolution. Now, around 300 million years ago, we had the dinosaurs on the Earth. And when we start to have a look at their brain, we don't see the mechanisms in the brain that we have today for fear. So their only response to anything that was threatening was to attack. And they used to attack things that were bigger than them, or there was just no fear. So obviously that's a bit life limiting and certainly career limiting. So let's have a look at what's going on inside the brain. So this is your brain, it's everybody's brain, a typical brain. To the left here we've got the front of the brain, and to the rear, or to the right, we've got the rear of the brain, and this is the brain as it's kind of cut through. Now originally, when mammals first started to develop, just before the mammals developed, and while we had reptiles, the reptilian brain looks a bit like this. So it's about that much of our brain, and that's a typical reptilian brain, and I can show you this. This is a scan of a shark from about, now sharks are about 350 million years old, and you can see there very limited brain. Virtually all of the processing there is to do with movement and hunting. There's no fear control center, so there's no sense of fear whatsoever. There's no emotion that we have at all. They don't have love or any other of those kinds of emotions whatsoever. So that equates to this area of our brain. Now, about 210 million years ago, the first mammals started to appear on Earth. Now, there were small shrew-like creatures largely, and they were warm-blooded, and that's what makes them mammals. Now, the area of the brain that developed with the mammals was this area called the limbic system. Now, the limbic system originally developed in order to help the mammal be able to adjust its own temperature. So that if it got too hot, it would start to sweat or pant or whatever mechanism that particular animal had, so that it could actually start to regulate its own temperature. It would also allow the animal to move in response to temperature, so that if it got too hot, it could go into the shade. If it got too cold, it would go out into the sun. It was the start of things like migrations. So you don't see reptiles migrating. If the ambient temperature around changes for a reptile, there's no sense that they're going to move or do anything. They'll just likely die out. And in fact, reptiles are completely temperature dependent because they're cold-blooded and they don't have this limbic system that helps the regulation. And indeed, with the older reptiles, the eggs are expelled and gestate outside of the body, usually in the ground, and the gender of the reptile is decided on the temperature, the ambient temperature around the egg or of the egg. So what you find is crocodiles, for example, will bury their eggs, and they'll bury them with rotting vegetation to keep the temperature up. There's a threshold level for for the eggs in reptiles. If the temperature that the egg gestates in goes over this threshold, then the babies are more likely to be male, and if it goes below the threshold, they're almost entirely female. So you can see in response to climatic change where the threat lies, and that you have a species that suddenly is giving birth to only one type of gender, and therefore there's a great threat to that particular species. And the species itself is temperature dependent. Whereas mammals can actually move. They can, because they're warm-blooded, they can actually exist in a wider climatic range, so they can go up further north and further south, and they can inhabit the hot areas as well. Now, along with this, because the thing that gets us to move is an emotional system, which is largely the limbic system, and along with this comes the fear control centers, which we'll have a look at in a moment. So the other thing that mammals did was they are largely what we call quadrupeds. Now, quadrupeds stand on all 4 feet, and all of their vital organs are largely protected by the backbone and the ribs. So the heart, the stomach, the genitals and the neck are down towards the ground, so it's harder to actually get to them. Now, as you'll see, we as human beings stood up round about 195,000 years ago and exposed all of those areas, and that became a great threat. But we had an advantage by standing up, as you'll see shortly. So we go back to the brain now, and this is the area that we get really interested in the limbic system, is the amygdala. And the amygdala really is the fear control center. And round about 210 million years ago, the mammals had a bit of a problem. They were very small, they were largely crunchy and squishy, and they were the only warm meal a reptile was likely to get. There was no sense in a mammal attacking a reptile whatsoever. They were just going to get eaten. So the half-time score around about 210 million years ago wasn't looking too good, and it wasn't looking very good for the mammals. So we started to develop a hardwire set of strategies to stop us getting eaten. And there were 3 strategies. So the first strategy that we see that developed was run. So if you see trouble coming, scarper as fast as you can. Now this has got quite a lot of advantages, because if you do run and you get away, you're going to get away with everything intact. There's going to be no damage done. And that's why it was advantageous for us to stand up and to get as high up as possible. Primates particularly are tree-dwelling animals, so they can see trouble coming from a distance, and that way they can run before the trouble even notices them and gets to them. So that's a really advantageous strategy that's hardwired into our brain, and today it equates to avoiding things and not wanting to do things, or going sick rather than doing the presentation. It's our version of running. The second strategy that developed is a strategy called freezing, and it's a bit like the rabbit caught in the headlights thing. So if the predator surprises us and is too close, running actually is a useless activity, because most predators are attracted by movement. So the thing to do is go to ground and stay very, very still. Now today we experience this by, and this is where the saying to freeze with fear comes from. This process, we experience it as mind blank. Actually what's happening is it's shutting down the mind and the body. Now we can get actually frozen with fear, but quite often what we do when we're scared is we experience the symptoms of not being able to remember things in exams, for example, or our mind going blank when we're doing a presentation or we're talking to people. And there's a particular type of goat called a myotonic goat, which I'm going to show you here, that has had the freeze response bred into it, as you can see. So you startle one of these goats and they freeze immediately. Now, these were bred into them, and these were what the term the original scapegoats. The freeze response was bred into them, and then they were mixed with sheep. Now, sheep were more expensive than goats. So if a wolf came along, the scapegoat, the goat would freeze, the goat would get it, the wolf would attack the goat, and the sheep would get off scot-free. And these are called myotonic goats. And if you go onto YouTube, you can see them under freezing goats. It's quite funny, but you can actually see the freeze response writ large there. And the third response is to attack, so aggression. Now, in the old days, before we were human beings and socialized and things, aggression meant fighting back, and you would bite, spit, claw, anything to survive. Now, today that's not socially acceptable, and usually we're not under that kind of direct physical threat, so it comes out in things like anger, narkiness, being grumpy, and things like that, bullying, those kinds of things quite often. So let's have a look at what actually happens inside our head when we start to get frightened. So let's go back to our brain here. Any information that comes into the brain through the eyes, the ears, and the senses goes straight to this organ right in the center that's called the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is a bit like a central processing unit in a computer. And what the thalamus does is it recodes everything and works out where to send the data. Now, all of the data, and I mean all of the data, goes to the amygdala, because the amygdala needs to do a threat assessment to see whether there's any threat in the situation. The thalamus then also sends the data to wherever it needs to be in the actual brain, in the neocortex. So the thalamus's job is to actually send this data where it goes. But the main thing to note here is that all of the data goes to the amygdala. And the amygdala has to make a rapid threat assessment. And I mean a rapid threat assessment, I mean a really, really rapid threat assessment. There are over 400 billion bits of information per second being presented to the brain. And the brain needs to filter all that information. It's too much information for the brain to cope with. So the first set of filtering is done at the thalamus, and the second set is done by the amygdala. And the amygdala needs to work out very quickly, and I mean very quickly, the amygdala reacts to a threat in 200 times the 200 times the time it takes you to blink. So it's 200 times quicker than your blink it will react to a threat assessment. So in order to do that, it has what we call heuristics, or rules of thumb, that it applies to a threat assessment. So things like, for example, one of the rules that the amygdala works is rapid movement. So if something moves fast, it will pay more attention to that because predators tend to strike fast in the last throws. So movement is a particular rule of thumb. And we see this particularly with things like phobias of spiders. Usually when we get to the trigger of a phobia of a spider, it's not the spider itself that's the issue. It's the movement that the spider's making, and usually the fact that spiders can move extremely fast and some of them can jump, that creates the phobia. And we find the same thing with dogs, cats, birds. All those kinds of phobias tend to be based on this rule of thumb that movement is a trigger. Now, the amygdala makes this threat assessment not just based on these rules of thumb, but also on what we call a threshold or a level. Now, if you're quite calm and relaxed, the amygdala's threshold is quite high, which means it's harder to breach. So we're less likely to get anxious if we're happy and relaxed. But if we're stressed, the threshold comes down and it's easier for us to breach. So let me just give you an example of this happening. So you just imagine a cave person living, or two cave people living in two valleys. Okay? So in the first valley is saber-toothed tiger valley. There's a lot of predators in that valley. It's quite stressful for the cave person to be living in that valley because at any moment they could be attacked. The other cave person is quite fortunate. They live in Buttercup Valley. It's a really nice green valley. They've rarely seen predators and they just love going for long walks. Whereas the cave person in Saber-Tooth Valley really does not like going for walks because it's a threat. So the first cave person in Saber-Tooth Valley is going to have a low threshold level. And if a bush shakes in that valley, their immediate assumption is, oh my God, what's going to happen here? They will be assuming a threat. Whereas a cave person in Buttercup Valley, if the bush shakes, will be thinking, oh, I wonder what that is. So what we see playing out here is a high threshold level in Buttercup Valley means that it's harder for the amygdala to actually trigger off. Whereas when we're under stress, the threshold level comes down and it's easier for things to trigger off anxiety. So we can be anxious more of the time. And I'll come back to these threshold levels in a further video because there's some other things here that become quite helpful. So assuming that the threshold is breached by the amygdala then springs into action. It does a number of things simultaneously. The first thing it does is it puts a wave of chemicals through the brain to shut the brain down. Now it does this because the brain outside of the limbic system is an immensely slow system. What we've discovered is that the amygdala reacts about 100 times faster than the brain reacts to fear, for example. In other words, what I'm saying here is that the amygdala knows that there's something threatening before you're even aware of it, and it's reacted. It's game over. It's happened. The reaction that basically the amygdala just takes control. So the first thing when there's a fear threat is it shuts down the brain. It doesn't want you thinking because it's too slow. And you just imagine, if you're walking through a forest and you come to a clearing, and there's in the clearing there's a family of saber-toothed tigers having a picnic or something like that. The last thing the amygdala wants you doing is going, "Oh, they've got brown eyes. I hadn't realised that." What it only wants you doing is getting out of there and fast. So it shuts the brain down and stops you thinking. It then pours a whole load of chemicals into your body. Remember that the limbic system is a chemical emotional system. It pours a load of chemicals, noradrenaline and other chemicals into your body to get it going and moving fast. So you start to run, and then 6 things start to happen almost simultaneously. And these are those 6 things. The first thing is that your vision will start to narrow. You'll start to get tunnel vision. All the peripheral vision will disappear. And the reason that happens is it doesn't want you getting distracted by things off to the left or the right. It just wants you focusing on jumping over the bits of wood and running down the path. That's all it wants. So we get this kind of tunnel vision. And you've probably experienced this when you've been extremely anxious, where all you can focus on is the next thing. Anything kind of strategic or anything off to the side you can't focus on. So the brain's doing the same thing. So the vision narrows and the brain narrows. The second thing is that our hearing starts to go, and in extreme cases goes completely. Because again, the amygdala does not want us getting distracted by noises either behind us or beside us or anything else. It just wants us to run. And if you've ever been involved in an accident, most people can't remember the sound of the accident. And that's because the hearing has gone completely, and it just shuts down the hearing completely. The next thing that happens is the capillaries start to close up, and it closes up for a couple of reasons. One is it'll create numbness, particularly in things like the fingers and the arms. And the other thing is because the capillaries are closing down, if you get cut, you're unlikely to bleed for a while. So if you've been frightened and you've cut yourself, you've probably noticed that there's been no blood until you calm down, and then all of a sudden it comes gushing out. Now that's got quite an advantage to it, because if you're running through a forest and you catch yourself on a branch, firstly the numbness means that you're not going to be hopping around holding your arm going ooch, ouch, each. You're going to keep running, you won't even notice it. And the second thing that will happen is if you do scratch yourself, there'll be no nice trail of blood for the predator to follow. So that's really advantageous. It's not so great if you're about to do a presentation or play a musical instrument on the stage because your fingers have gone numb, but that's the process if you're running, and that's what this was developed for 210 million years ago. So in addition, the next thing that happens is that all the conscious processes start to shut down. We start operating on automatic. You can't think straight, and you can't make decisions about what to do next. You're on automatic. And that's the fifth thing, is it wants you on automatic, because automatic from the limbic system, from the amygdala, is extremely fast. It will just make decisions for you to turn left, to turn right, to jump, to go up, to do whatever it does. And then the last thing, and I know this looks a bit weird, is you've probably noticed this if you've just about gone to do a presentation or you're scared of flying and you go and do a flight, you'll want to go to the toilet. Now, if you observe something like a deer or a rabbit when it's startled, the first thing is it'll freeze, and then when it unfreezes and it runs, or if it just starts to run, it'll usually do a poo. Now, we think that this is an evolutionary advantage, because if you leave a nice pile of smelly poo, one of the things that most predators have got is a really good sense of smell, and they'll probably go towards the poo just to sniff it. Even if it's only for a second, it gives you an advantage. So we get that feeling of wanting to go to the toilet, particularly when we're anxious. But the story doesn't quite end here. It's a little bit more complex than this, because we then developed this new area of our brain. So we get all the crinkly bit at the top, as you can see. So remember, the brain developed in 3 chunks largely. There's the reptilian brain, which is the brain stem and the pons and things like that on the right. Then the limbic system with the amygdala in the center, the thalamus, and if you can see the little purple worm thing, that's the hippocampus. Now the hippocampus is our long-term memory, and it's connected to the amygdala. So we think our memory developed all those millions of years ago in order to remember where trouble is. So for example, that the case of the clearing in the forest with the saber-toothed tigers, if you go there, meet the saber-toothed tigers, and you manage to get away with your life, the system wants to remember that there be tigers. So we develop a good memory for things, and this is where the triggers are stored in the long-term memory. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. So let's just go to this area that you can see highlighted here called the prefrontal lobe. This is almost uniquely human, definitely mammalian, and only in higher order mammals do you get the functioning in the prefrontal lobe. Now the functions we see in the prefrontal lobe are a working memory. So if I ask you to add up the following numbers, 2 plus 2 plus 3, what you're doing there is you're holding the 2 and the addition and the 2 and the addition and the last 3 in working memory in order to work them all out. So working memory is like a short-term memory in order to just process things. The other main faculties of the prefrontal lobe are decision making. Our imagination is held there, and this becomes really important in the story of anxiety, and planning. So the ability to be able to plan forward and think about things that don't yet exist. So if I ask you, for example, what are you going to do at the weekend, you've probably got some idea of what you're going to likely be doing at the weekend, and you can probably see it. Even though it's not happened yet, you can probably see it. So and that's largely a thing of the imagination. The imagination allows us to conjure up and see things that don't exist, and that becomes quite important. So what happens is, and I can prove this in a second, so what happens is we imagine something, and we imagine something horrible, like freezing on stage, or getting on an airplane and having a crash or something like that. And if you remember, the amygdala is scanning everything that comes into the brain, and I mean everything. So it starts to scan what's coming into the brain, and it sees these images. Now, and this is the problem. Let's just go back to the brain without the crinkly bits. So this is the brain as it was about 210 million years ago. So in those days, when the amygdala actually grew up and developed, there was no imagination and there were no conscious bits of the brain in order to think. All of the data that was coming into the amygdala through the thalamus was coming in directly from the outside. So now what we find is that the amygdala makes the assumption that anything that is coming into it is real and is happening right now. The only time frame that the amygdala understands is here and now, and it will assume everything is really happening and is happening right now. The trouble is, we have got this new bit that can make stuff up. But the amygdala doesn't understand that. It will assume that it's real and it's happening right now. So you kind of see this childlike brain, and it's a bit like a brain watching, a child watching Doctor Who that's assuming that it's all real. It's scary. And this is how we end up with anxiety, because most of it, as you'll see in the next video, most of it's actually created by our imagination and actually isn't real. How many times in reality and in honesty have you really honestly been in fear of your life, that you were about to be eaten and it was going to happen right now, genuinely? Very few times, and very few people these days do, because there aren't many wild animals and we're very unlikely to be killed right now. Now, there'll be some incidences, but they'll be few and far between, and they certainly won't be daily. The amygdala grew up in a world where it was a daily event that you were likely to be killed and eaten. So, what I want you to do, and this is your homework, is I want you to take some time now between this and the next video, and don't just go straight onto it, to observe your anxiety. I want you to notice what happens and in what order those things happen. Now, the thing with observing things is it actually disassociates you from them, and as you'll find, the more that you observe the anxiety, kind of like a scientist, as a dispassionate observer, just watching and trying to work out what happens when, you'll find that the power that the anxiety has over you gets less and less and less. So I'll see you on the next video. Take care, and don't forget to do the homework, because these things are important. They're an important part of the course. So I'll see you soon.